As we all know, AI gets a tremendous amount of attention, but ultimately, AI is only as useful as the data behind it. And when we start talking about getting your data ready, it can very quickly sound like a massive undertaking, a multi-year modernization project, or a complete overhaul of an agency's technology environment. Today's conversation, however, is really intended to challenge that assumption. We're going to look at what AI and data readiness actually mean in practice and get to the heart of how agencies can approach their technology and data environments in a way that is intentional, manageable, and tied to a real need. You'll hear first from a national perspective about what governments across the country are seeing as they prepare for and adopt AI. Then we'll bring that conversation down to the local level and look at how one city identified a very specific data and compliance challenge and addressed it through cooperative purchasing without trying to tackle everything at once. Because for many agencies, the path forward may not be about getting every piece of data perfect before you can begin. It may be about taking it one bite at a time. For example, identifying a high value problem, understanding the data that problem requires, and building intentionally from there. With that, I'll turn it over to Tim Rosner now to moderate our discussion.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that great introduction. Yes, my name is Tim Rosner. For those of you that are coming back and have seen our previous webinars, you may recognize me, but I will be moderating our webinar today. I am a mayor, and I also work in the GovTech industry, so I see both sides of a lot of these issues. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Rob Lloyd. Rob comes to us. He'll be speaking today, kind of that national perspective, as John just pointed out, and give us some perspective of what governments are seeing. Rob is the executive director of the Center for Public Sector AI and the Center for Digital Government. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rob. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you, Tim. And on behalf of the Center for Digital Government and Center for Public Sector AI, very glad to be here and share some of the work and benchmarking and research that we have. So my name is Rob Lloyd. I came to the Center for Digital Government about 5 months ago from the city of Seattle, where I led them as CTO. And before that was the deputy city manager for transportation, aviation, technology, and had the planning and permitting remit, and was previously their CIO. So about 20 years as a CIO and almost 30 years in local government. So, and part of the fellowship of the Gov. And so really respect all the work that everyone has and carries. So what I'm going to do is take us through really 3 threads that we're seeing across the country related to AI and its impacts on what governments are doing, how they're approaching things, and where they're having success, and also still dealing with some of the questions that are creating at the dais, creating at the operational level, and some of the conversations that we're having. First is that there is a maturity leap that's happening with AI in the last year and a half. There was a lot in the first year, maybe say 500 to 600 days after ChatGPT took off, which we kind of call the demonstration and performance of AI phase, where people were just trying to do something, and it became such a kind of flashpoint. But that phase is largely behind us. And what we have seen in the last roughly 12 to 16 months that is very positive is that people and organizations are very capable now of being able to say how AI is aligning towards organizational priorities, how they're going into AI initiatives able to say what value they're trying to create, even their quit criteria if things aren't trying to produce or aren't starting to produce value. Also, their responsible use infrastructure and how they're trying to say we're making sure that the human in the loop, human in the lead, how we're evaluating whether or not it's holding true to our values, and we'll get more into that. But much more clear-eyed about those things. And those priorities with quick criteria for success and clear value goals are really important in organizations because early on, it was a lot of experimentation and a very high fail rate. And we have a couple programs in the Digital States Awards, Digital Counties Awards, Digital Cities Awards, AI 50 Awards. where we get a great data feed about what people are trying to do, what's being successful, and what isn't. And the AI 50 awards were just awarded this week, and had a almost 3x increase in applications and submittals, and success rates, and people are able to submit much more clear-eyed and much more data-informed results from that work. The other thing we're seeing is leadership is playing a much more key and clear role. It's reaching across departments, and I have a kind of an analog where we say government used to be swim lanes, and you had a problem and you knew exactly what department to go to. And today it's more water polo. People are sharing a goal, but it's multidisciplinary. So housing, homelessness, you have public safety goals, economic opportunity, and reinventing how the economies work in cities and towns. None of them are one department anymore, and even a lot of them are regional in nature. And AI is being pointed at some of these main challenges. So the best operationalization of AI becomes more than one initiative at a time, and no isolated pilot is one of the findings that we see about AI. And the second thing that separated the best of the AI 50 was that they were government and partnered, built solutions to that specific local problem, but very rarely off the shelf. So they're not seeing things that are coming pre-built and just roll right into a government environment. But it takes some work across those departments. It takes some work going into community and saying, what are we trying to solve, and where the trust levels are, and how we're going to monitor and keep visibility on this and retrain it, and how do we point it at how we're going to sustain it from cost to architecture. And those are really important questions to ask and answer, because it goes at whether it can carry weight over several budget cycles, and changes in leadership and prioritization, and whether that sustainable architecture is there, and if it means it's going to last in practice. You know, in government, I've always had this analogy from our San Jose days: is once is nothing. In government, you have to be able to carry, and the question in the field has to grow into it. Let me shift threads now to what we're calling trust infrastructure. I think probably people can very quickly pull into mind a couple of examples of what I'm going to talk about. Every community and every company now knows the value of trust infrastructure, and there's three lenses on this. One is, as we go into AI, there is a lot of antipathy and distrust. And at the same time, two things can be true at the same time. High utilization, people are using it more than ever. 80+% of, according to our surveys, of people are saying they use it and use it regularly. And 80+% of people say they have distrust for it and what it's going to do to their jobs and to their lives. So two things true at the same time. In organizations and government, we see three lenses. If you're going to move into AI, those questions are and have to be answered. One is, when you approach AI, can you answer the question, and how do you answer the question? We're doing AI initiatives that are good and fair to our people, and this is how we've engaged them and answered that question. So we're doing right. And number two is, we're doing right by our community. And we've seen a couple very large examples where, if the community feels like AI or drones or cameras are being done to them rather than for them and for their benefit, there's some extreme examples, from a policy level and law level to even demonstrations on city halls or state legislatures. There's an interest here, and it begs conversation, and begs good policy and good project. And that has to be factored into AI initiatives, and the best across the country are doing better and right by this. The last one is the trust infrastructure related to contracts and services and vendors. And we've seen, at least when we do surveys, 80, almost 90% of services and contracts are now AI services and contracts. So for a number of months, we've been saying every service and contract is an AI service and contract today, and you have to treat it as such. And so some of that is coming in eyes wide open. Others, the reality is you're getting AI services and features that you haven't reviewed. The contract terms need to be artful because you want some of it, but how precise can you be in a somewhat nascent field? We're going to have to be figuring some of this stuff out, but you also don't want to sacrifice too much in those terms and tokenization, ingress, egress, inference costs. There's going to be a lot of activity of that in the next month or two. You're going to start seeing some of that emerging in at least some of the contract terms from some companies. So those three lenses of trust infrastructure, your staff, your public, and how we manage those vendor partners. And then the last one is just and I'll wrap this up very quickly. AI is changing how we practice and operate from our people, data governance, how we do privacy and security reviews, those community engagement things, and ultimately procurement as well. So we're moving at such a speed and pace and scale that government isn't necessarily designed for these things. And we used to complain in the past, but I'll give you like two examples. We have organizations across the country that have said we've had data officers and data governance folks, and for 20 years they've had their chance. We're eliminating the role and rolling it into the AI officer because it's about enablement. Privacy keeps on trying to force a checklist. We're moving it into cybersecurity. We're talking with our HR people about how to incorporate AI skills into job classifications. A lot is changing right now, and organizations are looking for data and skill enablement, and that's a really important shift. And so the two ethics here are how do we do responsible enablement, not just resistance for ideological purposes. And so instead of ideologues, practical idealists is one ethic that we're hearing. And we saw that in the AI 50 awards, is that story at scale. So participation hit a new high. People in the field showed a real step change in their sophistication over prior cycles. But to kind of put a point on it, the cities, counties, states, educational institutions, districts all demonstrated this exceptional operational and community impact, but not a single one cited this exhaustive data strategy or compliance structure. They did show responsible use and smart controls, but they're the ones that are saying we want to be roughly right, create opportunity, solve big problems that are hurting our community in time rather than be perfectly right never. And that's a very powerful push in what we're seeing in that trend. And at the same time, they're saying, how do we make it operationally carryable and sustainable over time? And there's a lot of technical stuff to that, from infrastructure to MCP or CLI, command line. And there's a lot of technical infrastructure and how you reskill your staff. And then also how you carry that into contracts and procurement. So with that, I'll say procurement does have a key role to play in this work and is a key partner, as well as HR is that final kind of read of the room. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Tim.
Well, thank you, Rob. That was excellent. Appreciate your insight into what's happening at the national level on this. I think it was really fascinating too about how it's starting to hit the job descriptions in terms of what are the AI skills that we need to have on staff and what does that look like and how does that align with our governance. That was really interesting points that I know even a lot of private companies are struggling with right now. So
yeah,
thank you for that. It's one thing to hear about this at the national level and kind of what we're seeing out there, but we thought it would be great to see an actual use case of an organization, and in this case, it's the city of University Park, Texas, and how they've tackled this problem in terms of data readiness and how do you create value without having to boil the whole ocean on this issue. So with that, I'd like to introduce Andy. He's from University Park, and he has a great story to tell us and talk through the challenges that they had as they implemented a solution within their organization. So with that, I'll turn it over to Andy. Welcome, Andy.
Thank you, Tim. And welcome to everybody that's online watching us. Appreciate you joining us today. So the story we have is a little bit different. So about me, first off, my name is Andy Atencio. I'm the Director of Information Services for the City of University Park, Texas. I've been here for a little over a year. Before that, I was with Summit County, Colorado, both as the IT director as well as an assistant county manager for a few years. Before that, I was 18 years at the City of Greenwood Village as the Chief Technology Officer for that organization. So I've been in local government for a little over 25 years in the technology space and also in leadership. So when I got to University Park, for those of you that are aware, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that went into effect in January, in last July, it changed the way that taxes handle overtime. And as a municipality, we didn't really have an issue with that last year because the reporting structure for that was all weighted on the employee. The employee had to be the one to figure out how exactly, they reported that on their taxes. We didn't really have to provide anything for that as an organization. But in 2026, that reporting shifts to the organization as part of the W-2. What we found was that the way that bill defines overtime is based off of the Fair Labor Standards Act, the FSLA definition of overtime, which the city does not necessarily adhere to. We pay for overtime for a number of categories of time that don't qualify as FSLA. So what we found was we couldn't actually report on that number because what we tracked as overtime was different than what FSLA tracked as overtime. In order to address that to start the year, our finance team, our payroll clerk, was basically manually making the translation from what we considered overtime to what the federal government considered to be overtime. This was all being done by manual calculations, one person at a time, every payroll, through an Excel spreadsheet, which was incredibly time consuming and not exactly effective. And really, for the most part, it didn't have any of the necessary background that it would need should we get audited for this data. So what we found was we needed to create a tool that would allow us to do this. Our existing ERP system, which is New World, did not provide the mechanism to track two different classifications of overtime, if you will. So what we ran into was a situation where we had to figure out how to do this through an automated purpose, while at the same time not implementing a whole new ERP system, which was something we were not prepared to take on as a project. We went through a process that I happened to be part of through the North Central Texas COG, where we did an RFP for various ERP systems. Out of that came a systems integrator that had some interesting ideas about how to handle data connectivity between disparate applications and not connected applications. And so I engaged this organization, the company called Phoenician, to tackle this problem with me. And what we found was we wound up creating a piece of software in conjunction with Phoenician that goes into our data set in New World and pulls out all of the payroll data, reclassifies that payroll data based on FSLA calculations, and spits out a number for us that then in turn is a true representation of what is considered to be tax exempt overtime. This happens on a regular basis, on an automated basis. I'm going to show the tool that we actually have here in just a few minutes. And what this does is it provides us the ability when we get to the end of the year to create a file that this tool that is called Beacon, it will generate this file, and it allows us then to reinstitute that information back into the right box in the W-2 within New World to then present that on the employee's W-2 as tax-free or non-taxed overtime. Excuse me. So the real key of all this, and the part of it that they've kind of asked me to speak to, is the procurement part of this. So the creation of the tool is something obviously that I'm incredibly proud of, both for the team that I have here at the city, as well as the partner that we chose, and the work that they did with us to get to the tool. But the procurement part of this is really where, and the data component of this is really where we really have to dig into. So for those of you that aren't aware, if you're not in Texas, there are cooperative agreements that you can take advantage of, and TXShare houses a lot of these cooperative agreements. And when we did the RFP with the COG to create this kind of marketplace, if you will, of ERP solutions, that provided me the avenue to get access to Phoenician as an organization without having to go through a full RFP process for this. What that allowed us to do was we leveraged the MSA that TXShare did, and then created a separate services agreement with a very, very defined set of scope. The question was asked, how did we keep focused on what it was we were trying to do and not get, dig into other things, and this turned into something bigger than it was. And it's because when I got together with our group, the first thing I did is I said, this is the problem that we have to solve. This is all we're going to solve, and we're not going to get into anything else. So rather than, trying to eat the entire elephant of fixing all the data in our ERP system, which still has to occur at some point, we were specifically focused on how do we take our overtime calculation and translate that into a calculation that then gets us to what we need for a W-2 at the end of 2026. And so we kept that focus in that scope very, very tight and very, very clear with everybody that was involved in it, whether it be my staff in the technology world, the finance staff, or the contract staff from Phoenician. And so that's kind of where we went. The contracting, you would look at something like this, and I'm sure people that are on this call have gone through this contracting process, and that you go through an RFP, and that takes 3 or 4 months, and then you finally select somebody, and then it takes you 4 or 5 weeks to get through a contracting process, and then you finally maybe 5 or 6 months into it, you're able to start development, and then you go back and forth with development under scope and try to create a scope. And maybe in a year, you've got your first kind of version of the product. That actually is not what we did. We took about 3 weeks to set up a scope and a services agreement, and the entire project took about 6 weeks to complete. We had a very tight timeline that we wanted to meet. And through the work of our staff as well as the Phoenician staff, we were able to do that. But all of it came out of the very tight scope, and then the ability to leverage the cooperative agreements from TXShare that allowed us to really kind of move this at a speed in which we needed to move it at. So that's kind of our story. I don't want to take up a whole lot more time with me talking, because I'm sure people have questions. But one of the things I do for sure want to do is show the tool that we developed. So I'm going to share my screen here real quick. So what you'll see is it creates a number of different data points that it's sharing across this interface. And what we wound up titling our generosity ledger is the city's generosity and how we pay overtime. So you'll see the difference between what the city has paid for overtime, and this is year to date as of today, compared to what FSLA defines as being overtime, which is roughly about $600,000 less than what we've paid in it. So this is the amount of money we actually had to report on W-2s, whereas this is the amount of money that we actually have paid out in overtime. The system goes in and does regular polls against our data within New World, pulls the data into the Beacon tool, and does all this calculation of the data and analysis of the data. One of the things that we did have to overcome in our data preparation was we didn't have some separate pay codes for some things like holidays. Holidays were just basically recorded as regular time for us. So, regular time is what you actually calculate FSLA overtime against, and that can include things like holidays. So we had to actually create a separate, a new set of pay codes for people to code their time to, which took some training and some effort on our part, but we were able to successfully achieve that so that the tool can split out the various types of things that we pay overtime against that the federal government does not recognize as being overtime eligible. The tool also provides the ability for finance or a director to look at their specific department and the amount of overtime that's being paid by an individual or a department as a whole. So I have my department called up here, and I have one person on my staff that is non-exempt, or excuse me, that is exempt and can be paid overtime. And so he hasn't had any overtime this week, so we don't have any numbers for him, but it shows his gross income. It shows his total number of hours. It shows all the data that it needs in order to calculate what that would look like. So this is the tool that we wound up building at the end of the year. Basically, it's really simple. Our payroll clerk is going to go up here and going to click on this button that says export, the Excel mirror export. And that's going to create the export file that's needed in order to then have that imported back into New World in order for us to populate the data into the correct box in the W-2 that allows this information to be recorded on people's tax information. So this is the end result of our project and what it came out to be. Like I said, you have the AI in the back end that's doing all of the data analysis and splitting all of the data. Is really quite comprehensive and does at this point an excellent job. Our payroll clerk has given it 2 thumbs up that it is as accurate as she was, which is a huge compliment from her. So that's kind of our story, if you will. I think that when people look at the data cleanup part of it, and Rob hit on this for a little bit. There's the old adage of, you can't eat an elephant all at once. You have to eat an elephant one bite at a time. And that's how we've approached our project with this, is knowing we know there's a lot of other problems with our data, both in New World as well as in other places that could have impacted, and we could have done some things as part of this project to address some of those data points, but we decided not to. And we decided not to because of the scope that we had. And we had a very clear end goal that we were trying to get to. If we had broadened this scope, or this scope had scope creep like a lot of projects do, we would have never met the timeline that we were trying to meet in order to start producing these reports. And the timeline really for us was the ability to do this by the time that the finance department started their annual audit. That's what we really were trying to hit. And so that's what kind of set our timeline. We were able to successfully do that. This system is live, has been live for a few months now. It's something that the department directors use on a regular basis to kind of evaluate their overtime usage and evaluate the way people are using overtime. So it's solved a lot of other things that we actually didn't really know that we were looking to solve, not just the W-2 issue, but also just an ability for managers to have a better window into what overtime looks like for their departments. So, Tim, that's kind of what I have. I know there's a lot of questions, and I want to try to make sure that we save plenty of time for that. So, with that, I'll turn it back to you, and we can start down the road of questions.
Could you talk a little bit more about how did you get, what were the tools, what were the processes that helped you get this project done in 6 weeks? I'm very interested in that.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for us wasn't the tool set, Tim. It was the people, right? Our payroll clerk has done this for 18 years. She's very set in her ways and how she does things. Getting her on board with the automation of this and the idea that the AI system could do the same kind of data analysis that she was doing and do it effectively was really our biggest hurdle, right? It was overcoming kind of the people set in their ways kinds of things was really our biggest hurdle. And to my staff's credit, they did a great job of helping her see the value in this, and getting her to the point where she was engaged and bought into this. And once she was engaged and bought into it, the project itself went fairly quickly. We had to work around some scheduling components because finance has their rhythm of things, and payroll, you can't do anything with a payroll person on a payroll week. And so we basically only had every other week that we could work with our payroll people when we did this. And having the on-prem version of our software versus a cloud version of our software did assist us a little bit because we have control over the data structure and the database. And that allowed us to really pull the data out and provide Phoenician the data that they needed in order to do the analysis and do the development on their side for the tool itself.
Great. Thanks, Andy. And a question just popped up, and it might be a good follow-on here. In terms of, where was the heavy lifting of the project? It sounds like you talked about it was a joint effort. Did you contract with any third party to help manage the project from a project management point of view or change management, or was it literally just a joint effort between you and the vendor?
No, it was literally just a joint effort between us and the vendor. We had basically three components involved. We had Phoenician as the vendor and the developer. We had two members of my team on the application side that were kind of trying to help do kind of the application translation, if you will, the technology translation between the vendor and the payroll people. And then we had our payroll clerk, one person on our payroll team. And that was really the team that developed the whole thing. The project was for the most part overseen by myself and the finance director as the project managers or stakeholders, if you will. So we kept an eye on kind of the project process and the progress of how things were going. But we really relied heavily on Phoenician's design model and kind of their development model to kind of guide us along the way, and then the technical expertise from our payroll clerk to kind of help get the information that Phoenician needed in order to develop the tool.
Yeah, finding or creating those change agents in your organization that are on board with the project that can help drive it is really important. As you go forward.
That was the heavy lifting, right? The heavy lifting was getting the people. The technology was the easy part. The heavy lifting was getting people that have a way of doing things to understand that there's potentially a different way of doing things that they haven't used for 18 years.
That's amazing. Thank you. I'm gonna pick on Rob for a second. Rob, we have a question in the Q&A for you, and Anthony is wondering, how are government agencies accounting for shadow AI? Especially with slow enterprise adoption.
Sure. I'll answer it maybe in two ways, possibly three. One is the compliance side, and there are lots of efforts to try to watch better. So you can talk about Darwin, you can talk about firewalls, you can talk about Defender. And so there are extremely good and smart concerted efforts for the security and privacy side to be able to see and manage better. And those are absolutely the right things to do. And on the other side, there is, and there is a very clear pattern of we're not going to do this with a heavy hand like we've done other things where people work around us. There is a very clear pattern of distributed enablement. So here's the responsible infrastructure. Here's how we're going to build the skills, build capacities. Your best path is with us because we have the contracts, we have the partnerships. We're going to make it really easy to do this well, do this at the best cost. But in the AI 50 Awards, it was actually one of the things on one of our slides that this is a very different pattern we've seen versus cybersecurity or privacy or with social media or any other technology. Whereas here's how to do it right. Here's how we're going to support you. And we're going to build some underlying exceptional skills so that you and departments can do this. And we're going to co-own it. Very, very different from past. And it also speaks to a couple other patterns that we've seen. And this is kind of the third thing I'll say is more communities have practiced with this than the other kind of sins of the past. So did we do it right with cloud? Probably not. Did we do it right with social media? Probably not. Did we do it right with cybersecurity? Probably not. But with AI, you have the GovAI Coalition. You have the Center for Public Sector AI. You have the Center for Democracy and Technology. There's a lot of policy and technical work. There are people who are trying to do it together and learn from each other and say, we're going to move at speed and scale and get this as right as fast as we can and learn from each other. And so this kind of communal learning with values for government by government is the GovAI Coalition's ethic. Center for Public Sector AI is best work, fastest to most. And so that kind of ethic is more germane here than we've seen anywhere else with any kind of technology trend. So all three things are at play.
Well, thank you, Rob. Interesting. I'm curious. I'm going to indulge myself and ask a follow-on question on that. When we think about AI in cities,
Sounds like a mayor.
Yeah, exactly. When we think about AI, a lot of cities, they're being subject to AI, and they probably don't even realize it yet. In terms of, I saw this great presentation where they showed a picture of your new city homepage, and it was a picture of Chat GPT prompt, because most people are using that to do searches, but it goes beyond a search and a link to a website. It's a search with information extracted from that website, whether it's good or bad. And I'm just curious what you're seeing in those areas and how people are thinking about that.
Yeah, and that's the care people are taking with the responsible AI. And it's not just as simple as creating that corpus and pointing at the internet and saying, have at it, because some of those answers can be wrong or old or of the wrong language, point to the wrong resources. And the observability of how right it is and to train it to get better is the key aspect of whether or not AI is appreciated and refines. And that's also the role of the human. So if something gives you an answer and then it directs you to the service or policy changes, because you and I both know councils can be quite creative, it has to be right and direct right and stay right. Otherwise, communities are very quick to say it sucks, it's wrong, it's a disaster, and then it escalates from there. And then you, in some ways, only have trust once before a narrative develops. And you have to have the right answers with AI to say, here's how we keep control of that. And the RAG model has this to train it. It's trained to use this voice. And that's a skill that your staff has to have. And even some vendors are too quick to put things out. And even the private sector has stories about how things went awry. But that's not as simple as just throwing it out there. And that's that experimental phase we saw in that first year or two. But skill, care, and here's how you have the visibility and observability to know that it's right and it's being maintained and staying right. And there's even model drift. So there's a lot to this, and it's not as simple as some people would make it out to be.
Thank you, Rob. I'm wondering when we're going to see the first city offer up a MCP that people can plug into to mine data within their website. I'm going to move on to another question. Let's see here. Someone asked, and maybe this is for Andy or Jonathan. They just want to, actually it's for Andy. Andy, could you talk a little bit more about the RFP and procurement process that you used with Phoenician and how that worked?
Yeah.
You alluded to, you didn't have to go through the big RFP process. I think they'd like to understand more about how that worked.
Yeah. So for, obviously in the state of Texas, for anything over a certain dollar amount, you're supposed to go to an RFP process. Although there is an exclusion for that if you can use a cooperative agreement that has already been negotiated either through the state or through another organization. You can, if you create an agreement between you and that other organization, you can leverage those cooperative agreements that have already occurred. And Jonathan, you can speak more to this once I get done answering kind of our piece of it. But what we do here at the city is we try to leverage the cooperative agreements that TXShare through the COG creates. And that's what we did with this. So roughly about a March or so, the COG did an RFP process for ERP systems, and a couple different components of that. One was specific ERP systems, like we see in government, like through vendors like Harris and Central Square and Tyler, and kind of the big kind of conglomerate ERP systems. And the other component of it was implementation services for ERP kinds of software. And they awarded contracts to the people that won through that RFP process. Phoenician was one of the companies that won a contract, a cooperative agreement contract through that process. And it just so happened that I was lucky enough to participate in that RFP process. So I got introduced to Phoenician through that process. Once that contract was in place, basically, I reached directly out to Phoenician and said, through this cooperative agreement, I want to engage you guys to help me develop this tool. We didn't do an RFP or anything. Basically, at that point, I did a sole source agreement with them and did a service contract with them, and off we were going. That was why we were able to do the contracting so quickly, was that I didn't actually have to go to a minimum three bid RFP process in order to engage them, because I utilized the vehicle that the COG had created in order to do the sole source contracting through the cooperative agreement.
Yeah, thanks for that, Andy. It's so basically you had a contract that had already been vetted and approved, and
Correct.
that the COG was able to provide, that you were able to piggyback on.
Correct.
Yeah. And it also sounds like, and maybe you could expand on it, your requirements really focused on outcomes as opposed to a detailed spec. Is that a true characterization?
Yeah, and there was a question that came into the Q&A that asked about kind of the data readiness that kind of fits into that same thing, Tim. So what we went into was, we had a very specific goal in mind, right? We had a very specific problem that we had to solve. We needed to get to the point where come January 2027, we could put a number that we could validate on a W-2 for every employee that had overtime that qualified under FSLA. That was the goal. And the goal was very, very, very clearly defined. What that did for us is two things. One, it allowed the scope to be very, very tight. So when we developed the scope didn't have any scope creep because we were moving towards a very specific outcome, as you said. That also allowed us to have a clear understanding of what data we really needed to look at. So we didn't have to look at, are we ready on every aspects of our data to start implementing this AI solution and develop this tool and analyze this data. We had to look at really three very specific fields in New World and say, is this data clean enough for us to use? So because we started with a very clear outcome, we were able to create a very clear statement of work that then provided Phoenician and us a very clear understanding of what data exactly it was we needed. And as long as we stayed focused on what the outcome was, that's what allowed us to really kind of stay focused and not veer off into all the other things that this could have possibly become.
The inevitable scope creep that always tries to
Correct. Yeah.
wrangle into your project, right?
I'm sure everybody's been involved in projects like that, and I have as well. And that was one of the fears going into this was, to answer this one simple question, it was suddenly going to become a 6-month process and a 6-month project. And that was something I really had to guard not only my team, but the finance team against, because we weren't trying to, to make everything. We were just trying to make this and solve this problem.
Thank you for that, Andy. Great answer. And I think I'm going to ask Rob to answer this question, but there's a question here about public trust, and just as an anecdote before I read it out, I was talking to one of our constituents in our community, and they made this statement. They said, well, I tried ChatGPT and it hallucinated. I don't trust AI. And that's their only reference point. So it feels like there's this educational piece that has to go on when you start talking about, for those of us that know the tech and know about RAGs and context aware AI, could you talk a little bit about best practices for how do you educate your community, as you start to roll out community-facing tools, that this AI is safe, that the hallucination is going to be at a bare minimum. Just what are some best practices that you're seeing out there for that?
Sure. And that's a very fair and good question. So, one of the first things you can probably say about AI is we do have to have some language triangulation around it. Artificial intelligence is at its best probabilistic human-based response. It sounds like someone who's been educated, but isn't well practiced. And the math behind it is probabilistic regressions, and it's based on a bunch of information, and it's going to give you its best assumption. It's like a well-educated person who's just not well practiced. And so the technology we develop around that, the string of models, the connecting it with a person to make sure that it's trained and incorrect answers are flagged, and the information we attach is current and accurate and reviewed, and it gets retrained when information is flagged as inaccurate. And when something is provided and said, would you like to start that permit or submit that application, it channels into a service, but it doesn't channel away from interaction, and it doesn't channel away from people. And that ultimately the decisions, especially the decisions that matter, are human based. And one of the things that we see as a great practice from the leaders is that there is a sampling, observability, and sampling ratio. So wherever there is a response, some percentage is reviewed. And the more risky the decision, the more that ratio is in the favor of a higher percentage have to be reviewed by a person. And the more of that is retrained, the more is checked, and the more channels. In the contracts that a lot of you will see for decision support systems, and a lot of them are categorized that way for a reason, prescriptions, health and human services systems, they will say in the contracts, this system cannot be used for that decision making. It can only be used for decision support, largely for liability reasons, because you can't necessarily fire the system, but the person is ultimately the expert, the trainer, and the responsible party. And so the communion we have to have with our community is at least threefold. Number one, we have good information and good setup, and our values are incorporated into that from procurement to implementation. Number two, our people are well trained and know how to operate it, and those controls are in place. And number three, we have a very good setup with our vendor community, and it's a known skill, and those contracts are well reinforced. But also a streak of honesty across all three, that nothing's perfect. And we can show you that this is better than how we perform, and we keep on getting continuously better. So that continuous improvement streak is there. And then you can have a very mature conversation. But I don't know about you, Tim. I have yet to find a public or private sector service that is 100% perfect. But we can have some good, honest conversations about those things.
Thanks, Rob. And maybe could you expand a little bit? There was a question in the queue about AI that deals with PII, or personally identified information, like even submitting a permit. It's a name, it's an address, it's a phone number. And
Yeah.
granted, that's a public record, but I'm just curious around best practices for that.
Yeah, and so that's the risk ratio that you have. Some of that is private and sensitive information, but some of it's public information that you have to provide as part of the public process. But the more the risk goes up, the higher the protections are, and the more the review and the human handling goes up. But that's stuff that in your contract and in your technical setup, you can actually incorporate, and also your security and privacy controls go up. A lot of cities, counties, states, educational institutions will favor the lower risk stuff early and say, let's learn with the lower risk. And then once we get a couple under our belt, we'll go up the ladder and get stronger. But we're going to be very intentional about risk ratio and do the harder stuff later. But there are, Microsoft has it, Anthropic has it in their harnesses. they have a lot of options for when you develop and deploy to manage for those risks. And you have choices to make, what you develop, what you deploy, and what information you're willing to accept. And you can say, I'm not going to do that service because that's going to handle information or processes that are higher in risk appetite than I'm willing to swallow right now.
Great. Well, thank you, Rob. One more quick question, and this one is for Andy. Andy, for this project, where is the compute for the project housed? And the attendee was curious, did you already have a policy on this topic in governing how compute resources would be gated or housed?
Yeah. So from the policy perspective, we somewhat had a policy around that. It really is something where I think still probably developing, just from the standpoint of this kind of a collaborative approach for us was a new approach. So we're still trying to develop all of the kind of policies and processes around how we govern some of these kinds of projects moving forward. Because of the time sensitive nature of this, I wasn't able to get everything that I probably needed from a governance perspective in place before we move forward with this. As far as where the compute sits, it really it's pulling data out of our on-prem New World system, pulling it into an environment that Phoenician has created on our servers, and running off of our environment. I didn't show the website address because it is actually publicly accessible, but the website address is off of our web server. We're hosting it. That all takes place off of our environment.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Andy, for that. And Rob, thank you very much for presenting today. Great conversation, great information. Really appreciate you, both of you coming on board and speaking at this particular webinar. With that, I'm going to close my portion out and the Q&A portion out, and I'm going to kick this back over to John Blackman, and he's going to give us some closing remarks.
I think one of the most important takeaways from today is that agencies don't have to solve everything at once. Whether you're thinking about AI readiness, data management, compliance, or even specific operational challenges, there is an opportunity to start with the problem in front of you and take an intentional path forward. And importantly, you don't have to start from scratch. Through TXShare, cooperative contracts are already in place for a wide range of technology solutions with suppliers ready to support agencies as those needs arise. And through our partnership with Civic Marketplace, we're helping make those contracts and solutions easier to find, understand, and put them to work. If you'd like to learn more about Civic Marketplace, including a demo or an introduction, please reach out after the call. The team is more than happy to share the solutions and tools that can put contracts like what Andy experienced right in your hands, ready to use, knowing they have been procured, and satisfy the regulations around those contracts, the mechanisms, the tools, all that stuff. So if something you heard today reflects a challenge your agency is facing, we encourage you to explore what's already available, and there may already be a cooperative path to the solution that you need. And with that, again, thank you, Andy, Rob, Tim. Thank you all for joining us here today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.